Supremacy of Christ. The entire 11th chapter of John's Gospel is centered, or it actually revolves around Jesus' claim that he is the resurrection and the life, that he is deity. He talks about the divinity of Christ. And of the 8 miracles that John recorded in his gospel, the raising of Lazarus is by far the most spectacular one in this gospel. Now, this means of the ones that was witnessed by people or anyone. Jesus' own resurrection on that day was not witnessed by anyone. The soldiers that were there, of course, they beat feet before he even came out because of whatever transpired when he arose. But let's go back to the other 6, since this one is going to be the 7th. What are they? First, we have the turning of the water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana. Then there was the healing of the official's son, who was in Capernaum. Jesus was not there, was about 12 hours away. The healing of the man who was sick for over 38 years at Bethesda, waiting for the waters to move so that somebody would hopefully carry him and he would be the first in the water to be healed. Then the feeding of the 5,000 men, which means that he fed over close to 14,000 to 15,000 people because you had the women and their children there. Then after the feeding, what transpired? Well, the disciples were told to get in the boat and go over to Capernaum. All right, they took off. And then we had one of those great storms that comes up in the Sea of Galilee. And serious enough, but to me I can also find a little bit of humor, because as it's written, there was Jesus walking on the water. And they saw him and they were scared. They thought it was a ghost. But John writes that it looked as if he was going to pass them up. I mean, the waves didn't bother him. The wind didn't bother him. And he looked at them and was like, hey, guys. But he reached the boat. And the minute that he got to the boat, they're at their destination. Faster than the Enterprise can energize and transport somebody in their transporter. Then, of course, we had the 6th one, which was the healing of the man who was born blind. And that transpired 3 to 4 months prior to this incident. This 7th and miraculous, powerful sign was going to be also powerful for encouraging the faith of the disciples, and a darn good rebuke to those unbelieving Jews and others that had hardened their heart and rejected him. All throughout his ministry, Jesus always was making surprising claims about himself. And with these claims, though, what did he do? He gave powerful and convincing evidence that through these miracles he performed, they all supported the truthfulness of his claims. Then when his enemies would ask him, and they didn't really ask, they demanded. It's like when you are talking to your children or to somebody else. Do you really ask? No, you demand an explanation of something. And from their tone, when you hear someone talk to you like that, or you're talking to them, you know that questions are being made. They are strong demands. So these Jewish leaders, they demanded that Jesus tell them, are you the Messiah? And Jesus would just point to the signs as proof of his authenticity. In chapter 5, the 36th verse, Jesus declared that all the works that the Father had assigned to him to do, all those works he had done. All of them were proof that the Father had sent him. Proof that he came from God the Father. So now we're coming up to this great and dramatic account of Lazarus being raised from the dead after being in the tomb for 4 days. And remember from last week, that's when decomposition usually starts. And for them, they knew that, hey, this guy was dead. According to their tradition, the soul of that spirit doesn't hang around. After 4 days, he takes off because there's no possibility that he could ever re-enter. That tradition that they had. So, I didn't bring the book with me, but I have it written down, so that's good. But I want to read verses 34 through 37. And this is from Kenneth Wust. It's an expanded translation. Kenneth Wust was professor of New Testament Greek at the Moody Bible Institute up until he died somewhere around the mid-60s. It's not a paraphrase and it's not an interpretation. He based all his works on the earliest and most accurate Greek texts. And so he uses quite a few English words, whatever is necessary, to bring out the richness and the clarity of the original Greek, which can then again bring new meaning to the language, to the message. So it starts, he says, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, be coming and see. Jesus burst into tears and wept silently. Then the Jews were saying, behold, how fond he was of him. But then certain ones of them said, was this not man Abel, who opened the eyes of the one who was blind, to have caused that even this one should not die? Jesus had a pretty good habit of polarizing people all throughout his ministry, pretty much like what we experience today. There's a lot of polarizing, and it's been all throughout history. So with Jesus, there were those who believed him and those who were committed against him. And in this incident here at Bethany, there was no exception. The Lord's healing of the man who was born blind, which was the last major miracle that he performed in Jerusalem, it's obvious that it really created quite a sensation, that people, still had it fresh in their minds. And this miracle, as I said, happened several months before. The mourners and the others there, some of them were probably mocking him, but they were still kind of perplexed, bemused. They knew that Jesus had the power to heal. And that's why they made reference to that previous incident, the miraculous healing of the man that was born blind. So, if Jesus loved Lazarus so much as he appeared to be, why in the world did he delay? That's what probably is running through their minds. He should have made every effort to get up to Bethany ASAP while Lazarus was still alive. I mean, shouldn't he? Isn't that what we do? And they're probably thinking that's what we would do. You know, we say a superficial prayer, and then we'll try to move heaven and earth and get out of work and do whatever it is that we have to do to get to where we have to go. We would have done that to get there. But the truth is, God operates all things according to the counsel of his will. Ephesians 1, verse 11. And he doesn't have to explain anything to anybody. Not you, not me, no one. Job 33. Jesus, on purpose, delayed because his purpose was not to heal Lazarus. His purpose was to let him die. And let me be a little whichever, to be good and dead, 4 days. His purpose was to raise him from the dead. And therefore, by that action, he was going to bring glory to himself and to God the Father. And when I'm talking to him, I always keep pointing to me. Don't mean anything. I'm just a finger pointer. But we got a slight little problem. It says that Jesus, again moved with indignation in himself, comes to the tomb. Now, it was a cave and a stone was lying on it. And Jesus says, remove the stone at once. That's one of the translations. How did he say it? Like a real nice guy. Hey guys, remove the stone at once. Or remove the stone now. The sister of the one who had died, Martha, she was the one that was headstrong, says to him, Lord, already there's an offensive odor, for it is 4 days. And here is where I like the King James, because it says, by this time he stinketh. Or let's put it in our words today, Lord, it's been 4 days, man. That guy stinks. The mourners were also expressing doubts as Jesus was approaching. He had burst into silent tears, and the mourners had commented, oh, see how fond he was of him. See how he loved him. Then they turn around and question that love. There's doubt. Now, we can be, anybody can be, you too, sit here and question them as to why they would doubt the Savior, the Lord himself. We do the same thing. At least I do at times. And we're on this side of the cross. We should know, are supposed to know better. Listen to me carefully, and I'm not, even though I'm doing this, I'm not doing that. We pray, and then at the end we add, sometimes maybe in a questioning tone, if the Lord wills. Now, it's true. He acts according to his own counsel, but are we truly meaning in our hearts, deep inside, that he will answer or grant our request in his own time, as he desires? Or are we giving ourselves an out, looking for an excuse to have in case, and it's more than probable that he won't answer our request or grant what we want? It's the motive behind the statement. Not all are like that, but I mean, it is. That runs through my mind. In the military years ago, we were told that there was a charge in the UCMJ called silent contempt. You could be given an order and, you're not going to like them all, but how you express yourself and your demeanor to your superior sort of gives away your feelings, or maybe contempt that you have for that individual. I never saw it used, but you ask, well, what's that got to do with this? God, our Father, sees and knows your heart, the depth of your heart, regardless of what you say. And I'll just leave it at that. Now, there at Bethany, seems that there was repeated doubts and suspicions. And this shakes Jesus visibly. I mean, John records it. Again, being deeply moved. Again, with indignation within himself. So it had to be visibly seen. When you're with somebody, friends, you can tell by simple body language or a slight facial expression, especially once you get to know them, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Well, Jesus was moved. He was disturbed. And who was it that questioned him? Martha. Lord, if you'd have been here. Mary. Lord, if you'd have been here. The mourners. Oh, see how he loved him. And then, couldn't the one who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man, from dying? How do we question the Lord? Lord, you've healed hundreds of others, and it's written in your word. You've allowed others to heal in your name. I mean, there's Peter and John and Paul. Let's go with Acts 5, beginning in part from verse 12 to 16. At the hands of the apostle, many signs and wonders were taking place among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. All the believers in the Lord, and multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. And to such an extent that they carried the sick out into the streets and laid them on the cots and pallets, so that when Peter walked by, at least his shadow might fall on any one of them. Now, it doesn't say necessarily that they were healed, but this is the hope that they had from the things that they had been seeing. Also, the people from the cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem were coming together and bringing people who were sick or afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all being healed. Paul in Ephesus, God, through him, was performing extraordinary miracles. This is still all in Acts. By the hands of Paul. So that handkerchiefs or aprons were even being carried from his body to the sick, and diseases left them, and evil spirits went out. I'll read that in Acts 19. Where do you think many denominations get these things about relics? Here, we've got a piece of the cross. We got a piece of dirt where Paul walked, the other Paul. You know. Speaking of evil spirits, let me add a little aside. This thing was going on so much. Remember the 7 sons of Seva? Seva, I think, was the high priest. And they were out, they were exorcists. And they came up to one man who was possessed. And they said, I adjure you by Jesus, whom Paul preaches. And this is where it becomes even a little bit humorous. The demon answered the 7 exorcists, the sons of Seva. He says, well, I recognize Jesus, and I know who Paul is. Who are you? I don't know you. And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them, subdued them all, and I'll use my words, he whooped them so bad that they ran out of the house, and then it says naked and wounded. I would like to put it, let's get country, they ran out butt naked and wounded. In Acts 28, remember, they're on their way to Rome, there's a shipwreck, and they ended up in Malta. And he was sitting there eating, or they were sitting there with the islanders, and a snake crawled out of the brushwood and latched onto him. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, now take note for all you guys that like to build fires outside in the woods, a viper driven out by the heat fastened itself on his hand. But Paul shook it off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. Now the people expected him to swell up or die suddenly. But after waiting and looking at him and seeing that nothing unusual happened to him, well, they changed their minds and they thought that he was a god. And this is where you get a lot of these snake handling Christians up in Virginia or I don't know where else. Also, because Jesus himself said, you will handle snakes. You know. The issue, though, is many look at these incidents and then we question Jesus' love because we doubt, even if it's very thinly veiled. Jesus chose to love Lazarus and his sisters by not coming right away. He chose to love them by not coming right away. And by not coming the moment that he was expected to. He sent that message, man, you get up here now. But his not coming now is going to be used to question his love. Lord, if you would have watched over my child, or my husband, or my wife, or my mother, maybe my mother-in-law, you know, they wouldn't have been in that accident, or they wouldn't have gotten cancer, or they wouldn't become ill terminally. Now, I'm not throwing condemnations at people like this, because it's a normal reaction, you know, in times of grief and deep grief. I realize that. But we, all believers and non-believers, need to see that the focus has to be taken away from themselves, from ourselves, and redirected onto Jesus Christ. And Jesus made that point when he told Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. So he's telling us, even today, in his word, with profound truth about himself, strong emotion from him, and with powerful action by himself. Truth. She says to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So she questioned him. She hasn't given up. But he replies to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this? And Jesus is revealing his glory with these words, with the truth. He says, I'm the arrival of the day. You thought that that the Messiah is going to come one day. I am the Messiah, he says. He shows it with emotion. Mary says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And as she said this, she was weeping, and those that were with her were weeping. So Jesus saw her weeping, it says in verse 33, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping. So now this questioning, where were you? Where were you when we needed you? Not in words, but in sobs. Where were you? Doesn't that sound like some of us, some of you? And Jesus responds this time not in words, but with a very strong emotion. He was shaken, he was upset, and he was disturbed. So now Jesus is going to act. But before he acts, there's emotion again. And the word that was used is a strong word for feeling of rebuke or warning, not his to him, but giving it out. We read that in verse 38. And this time it's connected more explicitly with the suspicion and the skepticism of the crowds. They question his love and his power. Back in verse 37. Therefore, he was deeply disturbed in his spirit and came to the tomb. So the whole story and the specific grammar point in another direction. Jesus is disturbed deeply that his motives and his power, that is his love, they're being questioned. And I go along with those that say that these emotions are a revelation of his glory. He's not a stone. As the great God-man, he had deep, strong emotions that always accorded perfectly with every situation. And this revelation also is an act of love. Even anger at unbelief and suspicion and questioning is an act of love. These are the very things that keep us from seeing the glory of Jesus Christ in our pain. Then the action. It's time not merely for truth, profound truth, like his response to Martha, or strong emotion, his response to Mary, and the crowds and those around. It's time for a very powerful action. And Jesus says, take away the stone. Remove the stone. One last time, Martha resists. And, she's not confident that he can do what? She doesn't even know what he's going to do. Look at him maybe one last time. Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he's been dead 4 days. And so in response, Jesus makes a connection from what he said that he was going to do back in verse 4. He's going to do this, and it connects with verse 4. This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And he tells her, didn't I tell you this? That if you believed, you would see the glory of God? He's telling her, I am the resurrection. That is part of my glory. And now, in response, Jesus makes the connection. Whoops. The supremacy of Christ. Jesus' glory is now on display. He prays. This is verses 41 to 42. He prays so that all can see and hear that he is one with the Father. And then he cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out. His hands and feet were bound with linen strips. And I want you to keep this in mind for when we get to the resurrection of Jesus. And a cloth was wrapped around his face. Remember this, cloth wrapped around his face, the cloth. Jesus then said to them, unbind him and let him go. This is the glory of Jesus. He raised Lazarus because he is the resurrection. He is the arrival in history of God's final glorious renovation for all things, including our bodies, your bodies, your bodies. Believers, and I'm going to use John's words from his apostles, children, you will be raised from the dead, and you will shine like the sun in the kingdom of your Father. Lazarus is just a preview of your resurrection, of the resurrection of all believers. Jesus is coming back to this earth in power and great glory. And this event, in this story, in this sermon, is a window to that glory. So what God is saying to you, to everyone, to me, is I love you. My love for you is not going to spare you from any suffering or physical death. It is a gift of myself, my glory. And he says, do you see me? Do you see me for who I really am? And he says, come to me. Come to me.